Back in 2016, I first covered the story of the Long Island serial killer, a previously unidentified killer who had been killing young sex workers in the area around New York City, and then dumping their bodies on or near Gilgo Beach, Long Island. At the time I covered those stories nearly 7 years ago, Lisk, as he has come to be known, had been dominant for at least a handful of years, but had left behind remains dating back to nearly a decade beforehand. Nobody was aware that this area was a serial killer's dumping ground until December of 2010. That is when a police officer took his dog out for a training exercise in the same area to try and find a young woman named Shannon Gilbert who'd gone missing earlier that year in May. Beforehand, she had made a panicked phone call to 911, a phone call that I've covered quite extensively on this podcast. That police officer's training exercise did not find the remains of Shannon Gilbert, but ended up discovering the remains of another missing woman, Melissa Barthelemy. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, several additional bodies would be found. All had been victims of homicide. Shannon Gilbert's remains were found months later, but her death has been attributed to misadventure by investigators. In the decade that has since passed, a lot has changed. This case has been profiled extensively in news stories, books, podcasts, documentaries, even a feature film released on Netflix a couple of years back. If you've been following along with my updates over the years, you might recall that police have been pretty tight-lipped about, well, almost everything tangentially linked to this case. As I mentioned a moment ago, Shannon Gilbert has been named a victim of misadventure, not murder, by police. But at the same time, that same police force defied several court orders to avoid releasing the audio of her panicked 911 call, claiming that it was somehow pertinent to their ongoing murder investigation. To learn more about that, I would defer you to my previous update episodes on this very case. Suffice it to say, however, my time spent covering and researching this story has been full of frustration. Not only because of what I believe to be investigative and administrative missteps by the police officials involved, but because of the grim, unsolved nature of the entire story, which has seen many family members and friends of the victims pass away, unable to see justice done for their murdered loved ones. Yet, those frustrations seemed to fade away for at least a little while on Friday morning, when I woke up to numerous text messages and emails from people telling me the great news: that police had identified and arrested a suspect in this white whale of a cold case.
Tell us, who you are, where you're from, and how long you've been in New York.
Okay. Rex Heuermann. I'm an architect. I'm an architectural consultant. I'm a troubleshooter. Born and raised on Long Island.
Okay.
Been working in Manhattan since 1987.
Oh, wow.
Very long time.
Okay.
What you just heard was the voice of Rex Heuermann from about a year ago, audio courtesy of Bonjour Realty on YouTube. At the time of his arrest, on the evening of July 13th, 2023, Rex Heuermann lived in Massapequa Park, New York, in an older, run-down home, along with his wife and 2 children. It was the home where Heuermann, 59 years old, had lived his entire life. Rex Heuermann graduated from local Berner High School in 1981, alongside, of all people, actor Billy Baldwin. Later, Heuermann graduated from the New York Institute of Technology with a degree in architectural technology, and began a long career working in construction and as an architect, a career that carried on until just a few days ago. He served as the president of his own company, RH Architecture Design, which he has owned since 1994. Those that have worked with him have described him as a meticulous worker, but also adversarial, sometimes unnecessarily so. In his personal life, it appears like Heuermann was engaged to his first wife in 1989, and the two married in 1990. The couple had at least one child together. He later divorced and remarried, but for the sake of his family, who were already dealing with quite a bit of shit at once, I would like to refrain from posting any personal information about them. I hope others do the same. Heuermann lived with his family in Massapequa Park, less than 20 miles from Gilgo Beach, where the bodies of several Lisk victims were found just over a decade ago. While many neighbors recall not paying him much attention over the years, others say that he and his tall, imposing frame were a creepy presence. Some state that he would glower at them from his yard or his front porch. and per a New York Times article published on July 15th, others say that they refused to walk in front of his house, even claiming to have avoided his house during trick-or-treating on Halloween. If you're wondering why this individual wasn't on the public's radar until this past week, well, fret not, you're not alone. It seems like the Gilgo Beach Homicide Investigation Task Force, assembled just recently, did not have him on their suspect board until just last year, 2022. He was reportedly linked to the case using good old-fashioned police work, per a source, and was arrested Thursday evening just outside of his office in Manhattan. Surveillance footage released online shows him walking down the street, and police officers quickly surrounding him in what were his final moments of unassuming freedom. The news broke that he had been arrested on Friday morning, July 14th, 2023, and he was arraigned later that afternoon. Throughout the day, investigators were seen by news crews outside of his home going in and out in a search for evidence, and at one point were seen carrying out a large freezer. There, outside his home in the middle of the day, police officials broke the silence, confirming what anonymous sources had been reporting for a few hours.
There's been some new developments in the Gilgo investigation. Last night, a little bit around 8:30 p.m. in the vicinity of 35th and 5th Avenue in the city, members assigned to the Gilgo Beach Task Force, which consisted of numerous detectives and investigators from the Suffolk County Police Department, as well as our partners in the FBI, did place one individual under arrest, transported him back to 30 Yaphank, which is our headquarters, and he's currently in custody at this time. The case is in grand jury. We anticipate an indictment later on this afternoon, and we're going to probably have a press conference around 4 to 5 o'clock this afternoon with the district attorney and a lot of the other leadership that law enforcement has out here in Suffolk County. I do have to take advantage of this opportunity and thank the teamwork, the effort, the work by all the members of the task force, allowing us to get to this point today. It was a collaborative effort. The resilient work that was done allowed us to place somebody into custody. But once again, there will be a lot more detailed press conference later on today, 4 o'clock, out in Riverhead at the district attorney's office.
As it turns out, Rex Heuermann has only been charged with killing 3 out of the original 4 victims found on Gilgo Beach. The women often referred to as the Gilgo 4, or the Lost Girls, thanks to Robert Kolker's amazing book on the subject. The 3 victims whose murder Rex Heuermann has been charged with are Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. He has not yet been charged in the death of the 4th, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, although he is still considered a prime suspect in her death, per police sources. In the chronology of this case, Maureen Brainerd Barnes was the first of these 4 victims to go missing, more than 2 years before the rest, and it was made clear in the prosecutor's documents that there just isn't enough digital evidence to connect Heuermann with her disappearance. However, as we'll cover, there is definitely a lot of evidence linking Heuermann to her case, and I think it's likely that we'll see some charges in it before long. To date, it remains unknown if Rex Heuermann was involved in any of the other cases linked to the Long Island serial killer. This includes Valerie Mack, formerly Manorville Jane Doe, or Jane Doe No. 6, identified in 2020, Jessica Taylor, who was killed back in 2003 and whose remains were also found in Manorville, as well as other unidentified Doe victims, such as Fire Island Jane Doe, John Doe, or Peaches, who was killed alongside her child, Baby Doe. Similarly, Shannon Gilbert's case remains labeled a death by misadventure, her case unaffected by Friday's revelation. In the 3 murders that Heuermann is accused of committing, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, he has been charged with 1st and 2nd degree murder. He pleaded not guilty on Friday, and his lawyer, Michael Brown, told reporters about the state's case. I will say to you folks that it's extremely circumstantial in nature. In terms of speaking to my client, the only thing I can tell you that he did say, as he was in tears, was, "I didn't do this." Yet, despite his assertion through tears that he didn't do this, the state's case against Rex Heuermann in the 3 murders he's been charged with, along with the 4th, that of Maureen Brainerd Barnes, is incredibly damning. More on that after the break. As I mentioned a moment ago, Rex Heuermann wasn't even considered a suspect in this case until 2022. It was last March, in fact, that a new task force, launched to spearhead this case, identified Heuermann as a possible suspect because of the vehicle he was driving at the time of the crimes. At the time the original Gilgo 4 victims went missing and were likely killed, Heuermann drove a first-generation Chevy Avalanche, which, at the time, were pretty unique looking, at least compared to other trucks. Heuermann had an Avalanche registered to him at the time, and this can even be seen in old Google Maps images of his home, parked along the street. We know that this vehicle was seen in relation to at least one of the victims. Witnesses that knew Amber Costello recall a client of hers driving a vehicle of this make and model, and that this was the last client she had been seen with. Other witnesses recall a similar vehicle driving down the street at around the same time she disappeared. In addition, Rex Heuermann himself bore a striking resemblance to this final client of Amber Costello's, who had been with her shortly before she originally went missing, per the documents released on Friday. According to witnesses, at around the time of these communications between the burner cell phone and the Costello phone on September 1st and 2nd, 2010, a prostitution client showed up at Ms. Costello's residence located in West Babylon, New York. After the client entered the home, a ruse was executed on the client whereby a person pretended to be the outraged boyfriend of Amber Costello and the client left from the residence, while Amber Costello retained the money the client had brought to pay for her services. Based upon interviews, that client was described as a large white male, approximately 6'4" to 6'6" in height, in his mid-40s, with dark bushy hair and big oval-style 1970s type eyeglasses. A witness described him to police as appearing like an ogre. Furthermore, a witness noticed a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche parked in the driveway of the residence. According to the witness, following the ruse, this client said he was just her friend. Tell her I'll give her a call, and walked out the front door. Thereafter, at approximately 1:18 a.m. on September 2nd, after the ruse had been perpetrated, the burner's cell phone sent a text message to the Costello phone which stated, "That was not nice, so do I get credit for next time?" Phone records show that the burner phone was located in Massapequa Park within 2 minutes of this text message being sent. Afterward, this client refused to go to the same house, using the aforementioned ruse as an excuse to meet Amber Costello and take her to another location. He reportedly only returned once more on September 2nd to just pick up Amber Costello, and this was the last time that she was seen alive, having left her cell phone behind. It's also worth pointing out that Rex Heuermann fits the description of the man witnesses had seen back in 2010 to a T. While he's now 59 years old, he would have been in his mid-40s at the time as described, and is incredibly tall and stout. In fact, even when surrounded by large police officers, he appears to be an Ed Kemper-esque figure, for those that are familiar with him in his case. Also, his description really fits that described by the witnesses to an uncanny degree. I mean, I'm not an Adonis, but Rex Heuermann is objectively not a handsome man. Per the bail application, additional evidence used to link Heuermann to the crimes included cell phone billing records for defendant Heuermann corresponding to cell site locations for 1, the burner cell phones used to arrange meetings with 3 of the 4 victims, 2, the taunting calls made to a relative of Ms. Barthelemy, 3, a call made by a detective to Ms. Barthelemy's cell phone while looking into her disappearance, and 4, calls checking voicemail on Ms. Brainerd Barnes' cell phone after her disappearance. In addition, Heuermann lived in Massapequa Park where the victims were believed to have disappeared from, and he worked in Midtown Manhattan, in the vicinity where the taunting calls were made to the sister of Ms. Barthelemy. Defendant Rex A. Heuermann is believed to be the person who used the burner cell phones to communicate with each of the 4 victims prior to their disappearances, and who used Ms. Brainerd Barnes' cell phone and Ms. Barthelemy's cell phone after their deaths. If you recall, in my original 3 episodes published back in 2016, I told you that the killer had made phone calls to family members of the victims. In particular, the younger sister of Melissa Barthelemy, who was the second of the Gilgo Four to be killed in 2009. At the time, this sister was just a child. Police released little information about these calls, only that the individual made sexually explicit comments to Melissa's little sister, and alluded to him looking at her dead body as they spoke. Later, it was revealed that this killer had a white inflection, and that the calls had been traced to Midtown Manhattan. Well, it sounds like these taunting phone calls, once the most haunting part of the story in my opinion, may have been the metaphorical nail in the coffin for the defendant, so to speak. While making these calls, Heuermann also had his burner cell phone and his company-provided cell phone on his person, and all three pinged off of the same cell towers at the same time. If this wasn't enough, in the time frame for the 3 crimes that he's been charged with, Rex Heuermann's family was out of town on vacation. In each case, Heuermann's wife and children had left the state of New York, leaving him alone in their home. The dates are almost impossibly coincidental. In July and August of 2009, the time frame of Melissa Barthelemy's disappearance and death, his family had traveled to Iceland. While they were gone, she had gone missing and her killer had made taunting phone calls to her family on July 17th and 23rd. Those phone calls stopped, correlating to the same time that Heuermann had joined his family in Iceland. However, the day after he returned to New York, on August 5th, the taunting calls to Melissa's loved ones continued. Then, in June of 2010, the time that Megan Waterman disappeared, Heuermann's family traveled to Maryland and were again out of the house. The same thing happened later that year, in August and September of 2010, when Amber Costello had gone missing. Heuermann's family had been in New Jersey during that time frame. The document released on Friday explicitly states that a lot of this information from 2007 hasn't been uncovered or retained, so it's unknown if Rex Heuermann's family had traveled out of the area in 2007 when Maureen Brainerd Barnes disappeared. It's possible that this is the only information investigators are still seeking to pin down, preventing charges in her case from being filed. Yet, only time will tell if that clears up. To make matters even worse for Rex Heuermann, the burner phones that he's reported to have used were linked to numerous online accounts, including email addresses he had used to contact sex workers, massage parlors, etc. He'd even signed up for a Tinder account with an alias, and emailed selfies of himself to send to sex workers to confirm his identity. However, the burner phones linked to one of these email accounts had made several grim and sadistic internet searches, including girl begging for rape porn, teen girl begging for rape porn, tied up and raped porn, girl hog-tied torture porn, Asian twink tied up porn. Yet, it somehow gets even more uncomfortable. Other searches included girl with face beat up, chubby 10-year-old girl crying, preteen girl with makeup, pretty girl with bruised face porn, crying girl painful anal. Honestly, pardon my language, this is just horrific sounding shit. It seems to me like, assuming that Heuermann is the Lisk, that his violent streak may have been aimed at underage girls, and the fact that the Gilgo Beach victims were all smaller in size and stature indicates to me that he had a type, and that more than anything, he seems to have enjoyed looking up images of young-looking girls being beaten, bound, and raped. The inclusion of the search for Asian twink tied-up porn also indicates to me at least that some of the other victims found near Gilgo Beach, such as the still unidentified John Doe found in women's clothing, may have also had some link to Rex Heuermann, but that's just me speculating. This burner phone was found on Rex Heuermann at the time of his arrest, and he had still been using it, and the accounts found on it, to contact sex workers to this day. Who's to say whether or not his crimes ever came to an end? Using these burner phones and their associated accounts, Heuermann also reportedly specifically looked up information about the Long Island serial killer, including searches like, why hasn't the Long Island serial killer been caught? Why would law enforcement not trace the calls made by the Long Island serial killer? Mapping the Long Island murder victims. He reportedly even sought information related to the victims and their families, including specific members of their family, perhaps the ones that he had spoken to years beforehand. He'd also reportedly looked up podcasts and documentaries regarding the case. Who knows, maybe he listened to my original episodes. If he did, I really don't know how to feel about that. Once police finally uncovered a link to Rex Heuermann through the prior witness descriptions and the burner phones, they began the process of comparing small hairs found at the crime scene to Heuermann and his family. They took trash from outside his home and discovered that some of the small hairs found on the belts and rope used to bind the victims belonged to Rex Heuermann's wife, who had been out of town at the time the victims disappeared and had presumably been killed. However, as someone who is currently married, I can testify that I still find my wife's hairs everywhere. Similarly, she constantly rails about finding my beard hairs everywhere. It seems like Rex Heuermann had not been cognizant of this fact, as not only were his wife's hairs found at the crime scene, but one small male hair found on Megan Waterman's remains was later confirmed to belong to Heuermann himself. Police had taken his DNA from a piece of pizza crust he'd thrown outside of his office in Manhattan. At a press conference held on Friday afternoon, police officials laid out the case against the accused.
Before I thank some folks and turn it over to our partners, I just want to talk a little bit about the evidence in the case. I know a lot of people know about the case. As I indicated, the victims went missing between July of 2010 and July of 2007 and September of 2010. And in December of 2010, they were their bodies were recovered. They were buried in a similar fashion, at a similar location, in a similar way. All the women were petite. They were they all did the same thing for a living. They all advertised the same way, and there were immediately there were similarities with regard to the crime scenes. All the women were bound at the head, at the midsection, or at the chest, and later at the legs. The other thing I think that was that's been talked about in the media was they were bound by burlap. That has taken a life of its own in the media, and the burlap has been described or thought to be the burlap that's used at a nursery for. That's not the burlap that was used in this case. The burlap was camouflage burlap used for duck blinds of hunting. Obviously it was used to hide, purposely hide the bodies. One thing that became immediately apparent was at the time of each of the murders, the murderer, the defendant Heuermann, he got a cell phone and a burner phone, which is prepaid and anonymous. And for each of the murders, he got an individual burner phone, and he used that to communicate with the victims. Then shortly after the death of the victims, he then would get rid of the burner phone. And right away in December of 2012, FBI CAST analysts, special agents with the CAST unit of the FBI, they immediately began looking at that cell site data. They compared the victims' phones with the burner phones, and they immediately honed in on some similarities, specifically in the Massapequa Park area. And they looked at an area of a confluence of 4 cell towers, and they realized that this had significance because the perpetrator of these crimes was probably located within this area at or around the times of the murder. And that was mapped out. That was called the box, and it was an area in Massapequa Park. The FBI also managed to do that for an area in Midtown Manhattan. And so that was an investigative lead. The other investigative lead at the time was, even though there was a significant amount of time that elapsed with regard to before the victims were recovered, there was some significant evidence recovered. Specifically, there was a hair recovered from Maureen Brainerd Barnes from a belt buckle that was around her legs. With regard to Megan Waterman, there were 3 hairs recovered from her, one from around her head area, one from around her leg area in the burlap, and then there was one caught in between the tape and that was recovered. Amber Costello also had a significant hair that was recovered during the time of the recovery. But again, the crime scene, because it was out there for so long and because it was exposed to the elements, those hairs were degraded, so you couldn't use traditional DNA analysis on it. You would have to wait and use mitochondrial DNA. And back in 2010, the technology wasn't there for mitochondrial DNA. So the investigation proceeded, but also technology proceeded as well. And then in January and February of 2022, we formed the task force. We began working collectively. And then a mere 6 weeks later, on March 14th, 2022, Rex Heuermann was identified for the first time. And the manner in which that was done was the New York State investigator looked at a database. Amber Costello, the day before her disappearance on September 1st, 2010, she met with an individual for the purposes of having him pay her money for her services. But she involved herself in a ruse where once the individual gave her money, and other individuals came into the house, pretended to be significant others, confronted the individual with the purpose of making that individual uncomfortable, having him leave without retrieving his money. And that's exactly what happened. So that individual was identified as a person who was between 6'4" and 6'6", a large man, thickly built, not necessarily overly muscular, but just a naturally big person with glasses, white, and dark hair. Also of significance was that the fact that he was driving a dark-colored black first generation Chevrolet Avalanche with a very unique feature that was between it's a pickup truck, so it was between the cab and the bed, and that was identified. Again, that was back in 2010. But it wasn't until March of 2022 that database was searched by the task force, and this individual was identified. That individual was Rex Heuermann, the defendant. And right away, there were some commonalities that came right to the fore. Rex Heuermann, 6'4", largely a large person, not necessarily muscular, but a very physically large person. He has glasses. He has the dark hair, and also of particular note, he owned at the time that first generation Chevy Avalanche. But there was more. He lived at 105 First Avenue, which was located within that box area that the FBI first discovered in 2012. But there was more. Also, he worked at the time at an architect, he owned his own architectural firm at an address at 19 West 36th Street in Midtown Manhattan. And that was also the area of interest that was identified by the FBI in 2012. Again, that was March 14th, 2022. And from that point on, our partners and my office, we used the grand jury to continue to investigate, and we executed over 300 subpoenas, search warrants pertaining to this individual to find out more information. One of the things that we did is we followed him because we wanted to get an abandonment sample of his DNA, which we were able to do. We also got DNA samples, abandonment samples from his family. And then we went back and we got mitochondrial DNA testing. And with regard to, there's an aspect of New York State law that doesn't allow me to talk about DNA testing, specifically at press conferences. It's so I can't do that. However, at the arraignment, And also, when we filed our bail letter, we talked about the significance of that evidence. So if anyone needs to see that, but suffice to say, that evidence was significant, especially with regard to the other evidence that we had developed. But it was there was another interesting aspect. We looked at the Heuermann family travel records, and we learned that during the murders of the last three women, Barthelemy, Waterman, and Costello, that during the commission of those murders, the defendant's wife and children were out of New York State, and he was alone in the tri-state area. We also went back and looked at his cell site records, and we compared his personal cell site records with that of the 4 target phones, and we saw that there was areas of commonality. In other words, that whenever the target phones would bounce off a cell tower, if the Heuermann personal phone bounced off a tower, it was always consistent and in close proximity with the target phones. And at no time was there ever an instant where those target phones were, for instance, in New Jersey while the defendant was on Long Island. So that was completely consistent. The other thing that we looked at was we looked at his use of burner phones, and we followed, using the grand jury, using the great investigative help from our partners, we followed his use of burner phones. We were able to identify 7 separate burner phones that he used. We were able to use fictitious or fraudulent email addresses and get Google warrants, and from there we got his searches, and we learned what the defendant was searching. In a 14-month period, he had over 200 searches pertaining to the Gilgo investigation. Not only was he looking at investigative insight, he was trying to figure out how is the task force using cell phones to try to figure out what's happening. What are the developments with regard to the task force? And this really supported our decision to keep our investigative focus secret, because we knew that this one person would be watching, and we didn't want to give him any insight into what we were doing. And we also didn't want him to know just how close we were getting. So we maintained the grand jury secrecy, and we maintained the integrity of our investigation. In addition to those Gilgo searches, he was compulsively searching pictures of the victims, but not only pictures of the victims, pictures of their relatives, their sisters, their children, and he was trying to locate those individuals. In addition to that, there was a lot of torture, porn, and what you would consider, depictions of women being abused, being raped, and being killed. In addition to all of that, we continued to look, and we were able to determine that Chevy Avalanche that was used during the commission of the Amber Costello crime, that Chevy Avalanche was in South Carolina. And again, with the help of our partners, we were able to seize that Chevy Avalanche pursuant to a search warrant, and we're certainly going to analyze that. In addition to that, pursuant to the arrest of the defendant last night by the Suffolk County Police Department, we obtained one of his burner phones, his last burner phones. As I said, this case is not over, it's only beginning. We're continuing to execute search warrants, and we anticipate getting more evidence. Before I turn it over to my partners, I want to thank a lot of people.
The press conference held on Friday is nearly an hour long, so I only played for you a small snippet. I thought I'd spare y'all from the rest, as it's full of a lot of thank yous and congratulations to various police officials and agencies, which I'm not sure how to feel about. On one hand, I do want to applaud the investigators and administrators that did bring this case to a potential resolution. That is an amazing feat, and they've helped bring answers to dozens of loved ones that desperately need it. But on the other hand, I would just like to remind the police agencies involved that it took them over a decade to do so, and it's not like this required any state-of-the-art DNA technology to crack. In fact, according to a police source I quoted earlier in this episode, the newly formed task force cracked this case through good old-fashioned police work, which is what we saw late last year when police finally cracked the case of the Delphi murders. In both cases, it seems like all investigators had to do to break the case wide open was to revisit some early leads, such as the sighting of the Chevy Avalanche at Amber Costello's house and the physical description of that client, and, I don't know, take it seriously? Like, trust me, I get it. Investigative work is hard. It is. I've spoken to many investigators who work long hours and do thankless work. However, in this case, the killer lived 20 minutes away from where the victims' bodies were found, lived in the town that they had all gone missing from, matched the description of someone seen with the victim right before she'd gone missing, drove the same type of vehicle seen by the aforementioned witnesses, and had left behind his own and his wife's hairs at the crime scene. That's not even getting into the burner phones, the potential link to Massapequa Park in Midtown Manhattan, and the other distressing things displayed by Rex Heuermann in his personal life. Like, how did this guy not get examined as a serious suspect until 2022? Neighbors described him as creepy, the type of guy whose house should be avoided on Halloween, and who was a noted asshole to most people in his own professional circle. How the hell did this guy, who stands like 6'6" and weighs at 300 pounds at least, avoid suspicion? I just don't get it. Like I said, I do want to applaud the investigators who worked on the task force and took over the investigation just last year. It seems like they quickly narrowed in on Heuermann and identified him as a probable suspect, and then realized the walking and talking red flag before them. But how many years were wasted doing fuck all while the victims' families had to plead for justice, for simple awareness? How many weeks or months were these families attempting to report their loved ones missing to a brick wall? Or how many years did Suffolk County waste defying court orders and refusing FBI assistance? Sorry, I know that I shouldn't be so cynical, especially in light of such a major break in this case, something that should be a cause for celebration. I know that these cases require a lot of cops doing thankless work to reach this type of resolution, and they should be rightfully rewarded and applauded. But I still just ache for the family members who are still awaiting justice, such as Maureen Brainerd Barnes, or the other victims found near Gilgo Beach whose identities remain unknown or whose cases remain unsolved. I only hope that they don't get forgotten in this maelstrom. If anything, I think that this case can serve as an example of what to do and maybe what not to do. A lot of great police work over the past year or so led to this arrest and indictment, but there were a lot of systematic issues that led to Rex Heuermann being overlooked as a suspect for over a decade. I hope that we all learn the right lessons from this case and begin taking credible leads seriously early on. Anyhow, I'm sorry about that. I'll step off of my soapbox now. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. If you're interested in listening to or watching the rest of the press conference, I'll make sure to include a link in the show notes. While this case is far from over, I'm sure you'll be hearing more from me on this front. I think we are inching closer to yet another case finally getting resolved.